Welcome to another episode of the Property Nomads Podcast, and today delighted to be joined by Rachel Ollington. Rachel has a plethora of experience within the property industry, and we're going to have a wide-ranging chat because we're singing from the same hymn sheet. Really, the approach that Rachel has and that we have here as well is to encourage people to get into property, speak about why they should be getting into property, specifically the buy-to-let area. So that's going to be the key focus of today's episode. But a little bit more about Rachel. She has a lot of experience within property. She's worked for independent family-run agencies, corporate agencies. She's part of the senior management team for Sarah Beanie's online estate agency, and she's worked doing sourcing and project managing as well. She bought her first house when she was 19. She runs her own estate agency business, and her main passion, big passion, is helping first-time buyers get onto the property ladder. So we're going to dispel some myths around that today. Rachel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So looking forward to this. We were having a bit of a laugh off air, weren't we? Because we had a wee chat, and I don't like to make assumptions of where people are from, but those a bit more in tune would probably have established that you are from Essex.
I am indeed, for my sins. I love Essex. Really.
No, it's all good. So never assume where someone's from. Always ask and be a bit more blasé about it. But
that's probably a top podcast tip.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Never make assumptions. But no, really looking forward to this. There's a lot we're going to talk about. Specifically, what I didn't mention in the intro is that, and hopefully you don't mind me saying that, you have a daughter who is potentially looking at getting sort of started or involved in property or just buying her own residence. And of course, as that is nowadays, it might be a lot tougher for people of that age than it was X amount of years ago. So we'll touch on that in due course. But no, thank you for taking the time out to be part of the show. Is there anything I missed out in the introduction that you wanted to add at all?
No, I don't think so. I am a landlord myself. I've got rental properties that obviously the single let properties that we rent out. And I'm a big advocate of helping people first of all get on the property ladder. And then when they're looking to make that first step, I think something that lots of people don't realise they can do is the let to buy. And actually, if you can afford to do it, or you maybe met somebody and you then buying a house together, you can actually rent your first property out and still be able to buy another property. And there's so many times I'm showing second time buyers around properties and they don't know that. So that's another a good angle of, even once you've got on the property ladder, actually getting into the property investment side of things as well.
Well, let's start there then, because that's quite a fascinating way to open the show. So for those that might not know that is a thing, let's go into that in more detail. So we're talking about someone that might own their own home, but then might want to buy another one, but then might still be able to keep their original. Is that the right end of the stick I've got?
Yeah, so it's similar to a buy to let mortgage, although I don't practice as a mortgage advisor at all. I have done my CMAP qualification that you need to be a mortgage advisor. And that was one of the things that I sort of asked additional questions around. And as well as getting that first mortgage that I was particularly interested in, it was how to increase your property investment once you're on the property ladder. Because as I say, people just assume you go up and up, you get a bigger property, you do this, you do that, and actually there's more shrewd, if you like, there's other ways of doing that and increasing your property, and still buying a bigger property, but you use your mortgage and you use the equity that you'd have got in your current home or your first home to then let that out, get an income in on that, and then buy your next property.
So why do you think, we're going to play devil's advocate now, why do you think that people don't think about that? Is it because it might be a knowledge gap there, or do you think it's something else they might not consider?
100%. So I'm sure we'll go on to talk about it later, but I think there's a massive knowledge gap initially in buying your first property. I think in and around property at all, unless your property sourcing. I think there's a lot of education out there, some good, some bad. That's a sort of a controversial subject in the industry, but around property sourcing and using your property knowledge to make money out of property that way. But actually, you don't have to be a property sourcer to make money out of property. You can look at these other ways, and that's where there's no education at all. You're not taught that in schools, how to get on the property ladder, or how to use the equity that you've got in your house, use your property as leverage to then build an investment and build an additional income, a side income. I'm not saying that letting is necessarily an easy income, because sometimes it definitely isn't an easy income, but it's still an additional income stream. So I don't think you're taught that anywhere. There's nowhere that you can go to learn that.
Well, I think it's fair to say that in general, that financial education, I mean, I don't remember doing any financial education at school, period. So that's a massive gap there in the market. And I think that, in the education system, I should say. And from my point of view, it's one of those things where there should be elements of that well, there's two sides to the argument, isn't there? Number one, the one argument would be, well, that should be taught in schools, etc., etc., etc. I agree. Then I'm sure you're going to have the more sinister side of it, where actually, if we look at the general scheme of things macroeconomically, I'm sure the government wants people to go in, get educated, pay their income tax, pay their national insurance, etc., 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 because ultimately that's what's funding the coffers. So I guess, I'm just trying to sort of try and be as neutral as possible.
Definitely. I mean, my biggest thing, and I'm a massive advocate for getting first-time buyers on the property ladder and to help people getting into invest in properties. But my biggest thing is choice. Actually, sometimes it's better for somebody to rent a property. If you're going to be moving for a job and you're going to be living there 6 months, why would you buy a house when you're going to live in a town for 6 months for your job and then move out again? Or if you want to test the waters before you move, buy a house together and you want to rent for a year. So everything has its place. The biggest, and it's just the choice. And without education, you don't have a choice, because you don't know what your choices are. And I think that's my biggest advocate, trying to get people information out there so people have a choice of what they want to do, rather than we've got to follow this line. Like you say, you've got to get your job, you've got to pay this, you've got to do that. It doesn't have to be that line. It's the fact that there is other choices that might be the right path for you, and just buying a property and increasing your size of your property and what you do and the asset that you live in. Well, obviously not everybody necessarily classes their own home as an asset. That's again another but yeah, it's a choice. And if you don't have that information and you don't have that education, you don't have a choice. And there's not really many industries or many paths that you can say there's that lack of education that people wouldn't have a freedom of choice.
Yeah, it's a very good way of putting it. Actually, I hadn't quite thought about it like that. Very good point. You stumped me that much. I haven't even.
Sorry.
No, it's good. Well, this is a conversational sort of episode anyway. There's no pre-planned questions as such. I guess on that. So how, in terms of the information that people need, then from your point of view, you've got a training course, and you put a lot of great content out there on social media anyway, so I should point that out to people that you do that, which is great. What do you think people are missing? Is it just that knowledge? Are they missing? I don't know. I don't really know what I'm trying to say, but I'll leave it at that. What do you think people are missing at the moment?
Well, I think it's twofold, really. I think it's the whole actual buying process, because generally when I see first-time buyers or people buying their first buy-to-let property, first time buyers, if their parents with all the best will in the world try and help them, they're giving them advice, and then when they come and speak to me and say, oh, my mum and dad said this differently, but their mum and dad bought 20 years ago was the last time they bought a house, and things have massively changed. So it's not even necessarily about a one-time education, it's about continuing that education, because yes, 20 years ago you could have a house on the market and you could bid 10,000 less and you'd make your way up and eventually you'd pay 5,000 less than asking price. That's not going to happen today. The chances are it's going to go over, because that's the market that we're in right now. So it's about continually having something that when you're buying today, you can refer to, and somebody who's buying in 5 or 10 years time can refer to something. It's updated and they can then refer to that, because it changes all the time. And yeah, I don't think we necessarily got that provision in place to not only give the education, but also keep up to date with it. Because things do change so quickly.
Just to add to that, I think something that's quite useful and also crucial, and I say this to a few people as well, is we've all got 24 hours in a day. I mean, give or take, there's obviously a bit of science out there that, you know, a day is not directly 24 hours. It might be a second longer or slow. Anyway, that's a different podcast for a different time. We've all got 24 hours in a day. So, you know, regardless whether you've got a 9 to 5 job or, you know, maybe you've got, you know, shift work, etc., 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 we've all got spare time. But regardless of what you may or may not think, we've all got spare time. So what you do in that spare time, you know, that is a choice. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, you know, things change. And again, we'll go into a couple of examples in a bit. But definitely, you know, what doesn't change is the sort of stupidity of politicians, which then will affect, or the stupidity of bankers, or the greed of bankers, I should say, that then affects macroeconomics, which affects geopolitics, which results in things like the global financial crisis of late 2007, 2008 and onwards. All the stuff we're going through, I'm just going to say from 2020, so various things of course have been happening.
There's too much to list.
Exactly. But I think what I'm trying to say is that there's always going to be some sort of cycle, and the signs are always, I'm not going to say they're always going to be the same, because that's not the case, but there are underlying factors that do exist. And yes, that information is out there. Yes, people have a duty, like yourself, myself, to provide as much information as we can. But people also, if they're interested in something, they'll go and study it. So I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It would be personal opinion there.
Yeah, I think my only sort of, not argument, but my only counter argument, I guess, against that would be that I think society has got a bit of a role to play in what you're told you believe. And I think a lot of people are told, you can't get on the property. Oh, it's too hard these days. Oh, the youngsters these days will never get on the property ladder. You'll never be able to afford to buy a house. And say, my daughter's 20. She's got friends that are at university. Some go to work. Some all different professions. But the one common denominator is they believe, they've not done any research. They've not done anything on it, but they believe they can't get on the property ladder. They believe they'll never be able to afford a house, and because that's just, it's out there. That's what's out there. And it is a common, anyone over a certain age goes, oh no, youngsters will never be able to get on the property ladder these days, and they believe it.
Yeah, on that, I think as you say, that's where, again, I'll try not to go off on an absolute tangent, but that's where the media has a big role to play, because some of the shit that we're force fed is, not even going to get started on. Some of the crap we're force fed is unbelievable. But the point that you're making is something I completely agree with, is if you are continually told something and it's going to be ingrained into your system, then of course that's probably going to turn into a belief at some point, isn't it? And that's probably the angle that we're coming from here.
Yeah. And say I've had a few people that are, say, from my daughter sort of being friends with them, that they've then followed my Instagram, and the information that was put out on there, I was like, I never knew that. And we done a post and was talking about a uni mortgage so that you can buy a property, say a 4-bed property while you're at uni. They base it on the rent. You're almost like a landlord straight away. The rent you can get from sharing that with your friends pays your mortgage, and when you finish your uni degree, you either get a normal mortgage or you sell that, and you're then on the property ladder. I was like, would never ever have known that was out there, and I'd never even think to look into what type of mortgage could I get at uni, because I just thought I'll never be able to get a house while I'm at uni, because that's just what I thought. So I think it's trying to get the two together. And say they wouldn't, if they hadn't have been friends with my daughters, they wouldn't have necessarily seen that information on my Instagram, because it's a property Instagram account, and at 20, if you think you can't buy a house, you don't look at property Instagram.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely true. Okay, so well, now you've mentioned sort of your daughter and her friends. Let's sort of go into that. And again, caveat for people listening, I don't have kids, so I'm not able to attack this from an angle of, well, you know, my child, etc. I don't have kids. Rachel, of course you do. So what sort of things do you hear quite a lot? And then how would you say, I guess basically what I'm trying to say is what's the issue, and then what's the solution to it? Is it moving to a different part of the country? Is it a uni mortgage, like you say? Give us some examples and just explain as much as you can to help put things into perspective.
I think it comes back to my main slogan, and that's choice. Actually, for somebody who maybe is training or becoming a nurse or a doctor or a policeman or fireman, there is a mortgage for you. They're specifically designed for service workers. There are mortgages for people who have recently qualified, accountants, solicitors, that sort of thing. So there are mortgages for most things, or there's help. So if you can't afford, if you need the first time buyer is getting older and older. I think it fluctuates, but I think it's about 34 to 36 at the moment. So a lot of people have started their family before they buy their first house. So if you can only afford a 1-bedroom flat and you need a 2-bedroom house because you started your family, look at shared ownership, because then you're only having to buy a percentage of that house. There's so many different help to buy schemes. As a first time buyer, I don't think that I've not done my completely, but I don't think there's ever been as many options for a first time buyer as there are now. But yeah, that's not I haven't researched that before I've come on. That's my opinion. In my 20 odd years of being in the property, working in property, I personally don't think I've seen as many schemes and government schemes and lender schemes to try and help you buy your first house. You can pretty much might have to work on your credit score or different bits and pieces, but within a couple of years of looking, you can buy your own house.
And caveat's probably not even the right word. I guess for those that are listening to this that might not be too au fait with the general geography of the UK, obviously you're in Essex, so that I'm just going to call it Southeast. I'm going to be blasé about it. You're in the Southeast. I'm recording this from Brighton, so I mean, again, Southeast, right, pretty much as far south as you could possibly, can roughly go in the UK. So I remember having this debate with friends before, when I finished university, and then also in the last 5 years, where most people born in and around the Southeast, a couple born in the Southwest, and I've lived in Hull for 4.5 years. Cracking place, thoroughly enjoyed it, had no issue with relocation, not a problem at all. But the minute you seem to mention going north to someone that's from the Southeast, it's almost like, what the hell are you talking about, mate? I ain't going up north. But actually, from an affordability point of view, let's just say you are a trained accountant, or you've got your CMAP like you have.
Yep.
Actually, hang on a minute. If you're earning X amount down south and your rent's high or your mortgage is high or whatever, well, if you go and say move to, I don't know, let's just pick a place at random, Newcastle. Well, actually, hang on a minute. Your purchasing power suddenly increased by quite a lot. Great city, great nightlife, lovely people, and it becomes more affordable. Even if you do, well, it should become more affordable. Even if you might have a slight reduction in your salary. Do you think?
I think we're finding. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm rambling away, but do you find that with the people that you speak to, if a lot of people are Southeast based, that in fact they're just not looking at other parts of the country because they don't want to?
Yeah, I definitely think there has been a stigma around sort of moving to cheaper areas. And I think when you say, I guess it's not just in property, I guess with anything, when someone says it's cheaper, they automatically assume it's something's inferior because it's cheaper. It sort of goes hand in hand. That's not necessarily the case. The only thing I was going to say, I would have 100% that was 100% the case before 2020. Now I think we've seen so much working from home, and people don't necessarily need to be in London to earn London wages anymore. So you can get a much bigger property outside of the southeast, if you like. You can get a bigger property, you're still earning those wages because you're still working, you're still doing the same job effectively, you're just doing it from home. And worst case, you've got a day or two that you're going to have a bit of a longer commute. But yeah, that you are seeing people more so now than ever before, I think, because I think there was a stigma attached to that, and people, particularly in London, you find it even with first-time buyers, because they living and work in that city life, they want a city pad and they can't necessarily afford a city pad. So it's like, oh, we're moving out, like we've got to move out because we can't afford it. Whereas I say now, I think people are realizing, well, if we're still going to earn that money, but we need to have a home office, we might as well move out, get that bigger house, have a nicer lifestyle in some cases, and and still have that benefit of bigger house and still have the benefit of being able to work from home.
Yeah, it's about how you think about it, and realize that, as you've said quite rightly, nothing's impossible here. Everything's completely possible. It's about having the knowledge, also I'd say knowing the right people, having a good team around you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where the as a parent, obviously, it's an industry I've grown up in. If my daughter said to me, luckily that's my husband's trade, but if my daughter said to me, come and have a look at a car with me, should I buy this car? I wouldn't have a clue whether she should buy that car or not, because I know zero about cars. But when it comes to houses and how she should buy her first house, as soon as she was 18, we said, right, come on, get a credit card, which all her friends were absolutely horrified at the fact that her mum had told her to get a credit card when she was 18. I said, if you don't start building your credit score now, when you do want to buy a house, you're not going to have a credit score. So let's start. And she uses it as a fuel card, buys her fuel, pays it off at the end of the month. And now it shows her good credit. And now she's 20 and she's got a good credit rating, whereas a lot of her friends have no credit rating because they've never done it, and they then go and get something silly go and get big credit on something silly rather than do it sensibly. So it's about, one, what to do, and two, how to do it most effectively. And say, if you aren't, as a parent, I would have to get somebody to help her look for a car because I wouldn't know what I was looking for. And I think as a parent, you think, how am I going to help them get a house? And because we bought 20 years ago, it's definitely different. And you have your stories. Everybody has a story. Oh, my nan bought her house for £5,000 and my mum and dad bought their house for 120. We've got a 4-bedroom detached we live in and they paid 120 for it 30 years ago, which is great, but that doesn't help them now. They're now thinking, oh my God, I can't do it because there's no houses for that price anymore. And yeah, I just, as much as people have good intentions, and everybody wants to help their child. No one thinks, oh, well, we won't help them. but I think it's that they don't know how as well. And I think that there's an education that side to be had as well. It's not just, I think I get as many parents message me through my Instagram asking for help. How can they help their child, or their child's done this, or their child's got this? What can they do next to be able to buy a house? Maybe it's just because they want to get rid of them a bit quicker. But I get just as many messages from parents as I do first-time buyers, which I think is amazing for parents. But it just goes to show that they don't have that education either.
Moving on to inflation. So this is something that's, again, at the time of recording, is quite rife. The reasons why it's rife are, again, I mean, that could be a whole podcast series in itself as to why things are as they are. Again, you could sort of sit on either end of the spectrum and say, oh, no one can see it coming, versus, oh, actually, hang on a minute, there's some serious stuff going on behind the scenes that people have, planned, etc., etc. But point being, with inflation, of course, that increases the price of things, assets, food, whatever it might be. Also, obviously, because it takes away purchasing power, it's like the ultimate stealth tax ever invented, inflation. So with inflation at the moment quite rife, that's pushing prices up. Do you think that that's why younger people, or people that are looking to maybe buy their first investment property or buy their first home, do you think they're looking at all this stuff we're getting from the news and it just seems like it's Armageddon and what's the point? They've defeated themselves before they've even started. Is that something you come across quite regularly?
Yeah, definitely. And say I am, for my sins, I am on Instagram a lot and posting a lot on there. And I think everything you see is how much more a property's gone up, how much an area has gone up in the last month. Year to date, the property market's gone up X%. Year to date, and month to date, this time last month you could get it for this, and this time this month you can get it for that. And I think they're the headlines, and that is, I'm not saying that they're false. I don't doubt that they're true, but it's not the whole story. Like I say, there's a lot more schemes and things out there now than there ever has been. There's a lot more help, but also, I know it has gone up slightly, but we've got, the interest rate is so low that actually what you're borrowing, the interest rate on what you're borrowing, I spoke to when you're out speaking to people, some of the interest rates that people got their mortgage on, they might have paid next like a low amount, or what you assume is a low amount for their property, but their interest rate was so high that they actually paid back loads more than they paid for their property because of their interest rate. It's only but I say they've not got that issue now, and I say I'm not saying it's the same. I think it probably is harder now for a few different factors, but only marginally harder. I just think it's different, and I think people perceive different as harder, and it's different to what you could do 20 years ago. It's different to what you could do 10 or even 30. It's different. It's not necessarily loads harder or loads easier. It's just different.
So let's explore that then. So, and again, just going to work with your experience here, not mine. I literally don't know what I was doing 20 years ago, to be brutally honest. Probably watching some form of sport and I imagine. So when you said that things are different from 20 years ago, again, drawing on your experience, we share some of the things that are different and why they might be different.
So I bought my first property in 2001. Yeah, 2001, I bought my first property. We bought a bungalow that when you walked in, you literally fell through the floor of the floorboards because they were rotten. So we completely had to, because that's what we could afford at the time. That's what we bought. And I think, again, there's probably a whole nother podcast, but I think the difference is society now, everybody is looking for an Instagram already house that looks amazing, and you can't necessarily afford that for your first house. It's called a property ladder for a reason. You start at the bottom and you work your way up. You don't jump to run 5 straight away. You're working your way up. But we had the potential then to make good money on that by doing it up and then selling it. And I do appreciate that there was quite a lot around that time. That was the sort of a doer-upper time, if you like. Lots of people were doing that to make money on their property. But I think there is still that opportunity now. Again, it's just different. So you're looking at your up and coming areas. So many areas are having a big load of money injected into them. Look and find properties in those areas that actually you don't even have to do the work to the property. It took us months of blood, sweat and tears to get that property how it was. Actually, you don't have to do that to your property because they're doing it to the area, and just that area coming up is going to add value to your property. So it's just about I guess thinking outside the box on how to get started. I spoke to a guy the other day. He's like, oh, my friend also, he was viewing a property. He's like, oh, I just don't think I'm going to be able to do. Really want something closer to work, blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh, a guy in my office is looking as well. I've given him your number. I was like, so if you're both looking for something that you can't afford, why are you not looking together to pull your resources, buy something together? And worst case, even if it is a little bit further out, you can carpool to work. There you go. You've got that's another way that you can sort of save money on it and set that up for a certain amount of time. And then if you buy right in the right area, or you add value to that property, when you come to your deal finishing in 2 or 3 years time, however long you're planning to have this set up, you can then both afford the property that you want. So it is just about thinking outside the box, I guess. And yeah, thinking outside the box is different now than it was 20 years ago.
I can well imagine. Absolutely. I think all I would add to that is that although that might have changed, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, the fundamentals haven't.
Not at all.
So yeah, it's everything you've just said. You know, what's going on in the area. You know, is there a lot of outside investment going in? Maybe there's a new train station being built or new connections. Is it close to an airport or whatever it may or may not be? Then, you know, that always helps. And that sort of level of analysis, I'd be confident in saying that's probably been around for thousands of years.
It has, and yet nobody has that education.
Scary.
You ask a 22, 23-year-old, how are you going to look at buying a property in an up and coming area? They'll look at you blank. They don't know how they're going to do that. But like you say, it's been around forever. That hasn't changed. That's still always been there, but they don't know it. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is, and it's. I think to give some balance on the conversation, is you did touch upon this at the start, that actually sometimes, although we're both very passionate about adding value and getting people onto the ladder, etc., yet sometimes, depending on your circumstances or depending on your outlook in life and what you want, actually, do you know what? Sometimes it is perfectly okay to not want to be on said ladder, and it's perfectly acceptable if you don't want to invest in property. I'm sure that's a stance that you and I would probably not always agree with, because, you know, we're advocates of the bricks and mortar, of course we are. Yeah, it's perfectly acceptable not to want to get on the ladder if you want to do a lot of traveling or whatever it might be. Yeah,
I think 100%. I mean, I'm a landlord. I definitely always want there to be a market for rentals. That's part of my passive income. I say not necessarily easy. I'm going with passive, not easy income. But so I always want there to be a place for rentals. And again, it just comes back to choice. Some people don't want the responsibility of having to maintain a house. Some people want the freedom that if they wanted to, they could give 2 months notice and they could move to the other side of the country. They've not got to sell up and go through all that rigmarole of doing that. And some people want to try different areas. Like say, some people want to go traveling and come back. It's not necessarily everybody's life path, which I think goes back to your point of we're trained to think that we've got to do this and then do this, then do this. And that's not necessarily the case. The same as you can diversify your property, you can diversify the fact that you don't want to, and it is a choice. There are things that I definitely think, oh, that's interesting to invest in that, but I know nothing about it. And if in all honesty, I'm a busy person, I know nothing about it, so I invest in property because I know property. But there might be people out there that really know crypto or really into something else, and they go, actually, I would rather invest my money in that and rent my house. So it's all down to the individual, but the biggest thing is that somebody has the choice. I listened to I think I read it somewhere the other day that somebody said there was a high percentage of renters that were unhappy with renting, and people assume they're unhappy with their landlord, or they're unhappy with their property, or they're unhappy with something about their rental. And it's not that necessarily. They're unhappy that they are a renter. They don't want to be a renter. They want to own their own house. So I think if that's their choice and they want to own their own house, they should be given the education and the tools that they can put a plan in place and do that.
Couldn't agree more. You should be able to have the choice. And it's not always easy. Life isn't designed to be easy. By any stretch of the imagination, it's not designed to be easy. But if you've got, and I found this with my flatmate that I used to live with. Now I'm an advocate of renting. I'm not just saying that because I'm, my business partner and I are landlords. I'm quite happy renting as well, to be perfectly honest. Why? Because if something goes wrong, chances are, if you've got a good rapport with said landlord, landlady, chances are, that's going to be all right. It's like having a leased car. Love having a leased car. No issues. Forget a burst tire, boom, straight off to the garage. I'm not having to think about credit card, this credit, whatever. Yeah. So that was the angle that I was coming from. And, my ex-flatmate, lovely woman, she's hell-bent on getting her own home. Why is that? Well, she wants to do I won't explain what she wants to do. Well, she wants to, she had a little 10, 20-year goal. This is what I want to do. This is how I'm going to get started. My mortgage at the end of the day is going to be less than my rent. So I'm saving, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm hoping by the time this episode goes out that she would have ended up purchasing her home, and fair play to her, because she's got that strategy. She put her mind to it, done what I would call the typical work hard, save hard, quite frugal with her spending. And I took a great advice from mortgage broker. Credit cards as well, like you mentioned, start building that, score up, etc. So I'm hoping by the time this episode goes out, she would have got that. Do I necessarily agree with it 100%? No, but then my mind is thinking about other things. But for her, it works, and she would have gone out and achieved what she set her mind to. So it's not impossible. As you say, it is down to that choice. And would you say to people that when they're thinking about this sort of thing, we're not saying come out with your, life plan for the next 50, 60 years, but would you say it's important to have some idea of what you're trying to achieve in the first place?
Yeah, I think so. And trying to get some education around that. I spoke to a couple who actually renting is working for them. They wanted to buy their own house. They couldn't afford it. So I said, okay, so we looked at different options of what they could afford. And they could afford a 1-bedroom flat. They wanted a 2-bedroom house. They had a baby on the way. So they bought the 1-bedroom flat. They rent that 1-bedroom flat out. And then they rent themselves a 2-bedroom house, because that's what works for them, because they wanted to own a property. They couldn't own what they needed. So it's, again, thinking outside the box and looking at your choices of what you can do. So they are property owners and landlords because they rent their flat out, but they also rent. And again, I think people don't necessarily see that as an option. You don't just have to buy the house that you're living in. You can buy a house and say, buy a smaller house that you can afford, rent it out, and then you rent the house that's big enough for you. So yeah, again, it's choice each time.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's probably a very good place to end, to be honest, Rachel. I think that's very, very poignant. Just before we wrap up and before sort of explain how people can get hold of you and get in touch with you, apart from the word choice, if you had to summarize what we've just spoken about, maybe give a couple, I don't know, 2 or 3 top tips as such, what would you say to people that are looking to either buy their first, what would you say to people that are looking to buy their first property in whatever capacity they're looking to buy it?
I think get some education, where in whatever form suits you, but get some education around that, so you don't just necessarily follow that one path or give up because you think you can't follow that one path. There are other options out there. So that's always my biggest tip. And again, I guess education, it comes down to the same sort of thing. Do your research when it comes to mortgages, when it comes to looking at your house, when it comes to looking at your area, when it comes to look at where you can add value that's going to benefit you further down the line. And that would take me on to my last one, I guess, would be, don't necessarily think short term, do think long term. So if you can't afford the property that you want right now, buy a property that somebody else is going to want to live in, or that when you want to sell it in 2 years' time is going to be appealing to lots of people, so you can easily sell and add value to that and then move on to what you can do. So yeah, look at the bigger picture rather than just the immediate future.
Great stuff. I echo.
Sorry, that was a lot of stuff.
No, it's all about adding value. I would echo every single word of that. The thing I'd add to that, if I may, is to make sure, as and when you're doing all that, have a great team around you as well to set advice and so forth. Superb. Rachel, that's great. Absolutely wonderful. People want to get hold of you to find out more about yourself, your products, your services, and the general information that you so wonderfully do on Instagram. How do people find you?
I'm at All Things Property with Rach on Instagram. That's probably the best. You can find me there most of the time. My inbox is very full because there are lots of people wanting to know that knowledge, which is amazing.
Great stuff. And as usual, we'll put that into the show notes. So head across to the show notes, go and get in contact with Rachel. And absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for your time, and happy investing, and good luck helping your daughter.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been amazing.